via our live stream. Dana Kramer will be managing the chat, so please feel free to add your questions and she will feed them to us today. So I'm Kathy Steele and I'm the CEO of Red Caffeine and your host today. And for those of you unfamiliar with Red Caffeine, we are a growth consultancy and it's our mission to build badass brands that people want to work with and for. And so today, I'm guessing that you're probably here to learn how to improve your recruiting and retention strategies. If that's the case, you're not alone. If you're like most leaders running organizations today, or you're leading the HR function for your company, the volatile economic conditions and mass layoffs in certain sectors are really contrasting what we're seeing in terms of unemployment rate. So it's very, very confusing for leaders today. So hiring slowdowns, returning to the office or not, pay transparency, and quiet quitting are all things that are impacting us right now. And so at Red Caffeine, we have changed the way organizations think about their growth, and with really one universal truth, that is a choice that we're all making, and it's just really a choice that we're all trying to improve a little bit each and every day. So one of the ways we help our clients is by leveling up their talent strategies with proven best practices. And we don't just make it up as we go along. We really are looking to leaders like our guest today, to learn the best approaches from industry experts. And so we're really thrilled to have Lynn Fayoumi from HR Source with us again. Lynn has been a guest before, if you're a regular attendee of the Business as Unusual series, and she's co-hosted, and she always brings so much value to the conversation because she's really got her finger on the pulse of the talent space. She is the president and CEO of HR Source, as I mentioned, and they're a Chicago-based employer association with over 1,200 member organizations. So she's got, the insights of so many different leaders and so many different market sectors. She's a highly respected speaker as well, trainer and advisor, and accepted authority on workplace issues, including culture, employment trends, and HR management. Countless organizations have benefited by her expertise during her distinguished career at HR Source. So we're just, again, thrilled to have you, Lynn. It's always a very thrilling conversation. And so as we were starting to sort of prep for today's session, we were talking a little bit about, you're just coming off a conference. So you really do have your finger on the pulse. Just a week ago from yesterday, you hosted the HR Everything Conference. And so you guys were covering topics like making remote and hybrid work, America's demographic drought, which I'm very interested in hearing a little bit more on, skills development, surviving a wage and hour investigation. And so those were some of the things that were in your agenda, but tell us, what were some of the hot button topics that people were focused on at your sessions last week?
Great. Well, first off, Kathy, thank you to you and the Red Caffeine team. We really enjoy partnering with you on events like this and others, and I appreciate all the kind words you had to say about HR Source and me personally. It's been a real treat to have these ongoing discussions with you. I feel like we never have enough of them because we have so much on our agenda, because so much is happening in the talent and workplace space. The pandemic created additional challenges, and employers are still trying to kind of get their footing again and face the future with optimism in spite of all these headwinds. And right now there's a storm here in Chicagoland or brewing. So if you hear the thunder and lightning, maybe that's what employers feel a little bit like on a daily basis as challenges continue to arise. So at our conference last week, which we call our All Together HR conference, which covers everything HR, we had over 300 Illinois employers. And we started the day with a keynote presentation, which really energized our attendees on the topic of cultivating talent. It started with the premise that instead of employers thinking of employees as just another resource, employees, we've learned, think of their relationship with their employer like they do other relationships. So they're looking for a lot more than just a paycheck. So the fact that we are in a challenging time, recruiting and retaining talent means we need to take a different approach and spend a lot more time getting to know our employees and nurturing and cultivating our talent, as opposed to thinking of them as completely replaceable resources, because we know that's pretty challenging. We also had great sessions on employment laws and the changing landscape there. There's a lot of case law coming out, both at a federal and state level, that's very instructive for employees. The courts are often coming down on the side of employees, which provides some critical lessons and necessitates changes in policies and practices in areas like pay transparency, which we're going to talk about, employment contracts, severance agreements, all sorts of issues that are hard to stay on top of. We also did a number of breakout sessions on the hybrid workplace, which I know we're going to delve into more deeply, but that continues to be a very hot topic as employers try to figure out whether or not they need brick and mortar, what motivates people to get back to the office, what are some benefits that they can provide that will be of value to employees in today's environment. So there were just lots of hot topics, lots of energy in the crowd, and lots of really compelling and interesting dialogue about the different choices employers are making.
Yeah, I know. I'm sorry to have missed it. I was not in Chicago, so it sounded like a really great array of content. I do have to ask this demographic drought. Can you just explain that concept a little bit? I am very intrigued by what that session entailed.
So population is changing, and not all of the trends we're seeing are just related to the pandemic, right? Like baby boomers, I'm at the very end of the baby boom, and we knew baby boomers were going to be retiring. So some people are calling this the silver wave. We also knew that younger employees were not going to be looking for the traditional long tenured employment opportunities that people did in the past. We also have some concerning trends about workplace participation rates. For example, 40 years ago, when I was first a young employee, about 60% of teenagers worked and liked working and liked earning a paycheck. That labor force participation rate is now down to 37%.
Wow.
So there are all sorts of trends going on. Add to that the fact that many young males are either in legal trouble, choosing to game in their parents' basement, are not entering the workplace at the same rate that they once did. Many even college educated young employees decided to leave the workplace for a whole range of reasons and be a digital nomad or move across the country or be a gig worker. So there are just a lot of different trends impacting the ability of employers to hire in a traditional way. And many of these trends are new and emerging, but others have been on the radar screen for many years, but not necessarily moving in a direction that is good news for employers.
Well, it's a bit troubling. I mean, we're already facing so many, unique conditions around, performance and our economy, and just there never seems to be any good news. So it is troubling to hear that we're, going to have to be combating even more new issues. So I was curious if the democratic drought also like was hitting certain sectors, because I do feel like the gig workforce, the contract workers, like we have both full-time employees and do employ some contract workers. And I think that we've really enjoyed that flexibility of staffing strategy, but I have a sense that we're going to start to get way more regulation around those type of employment agreements, and there's going to be a lot more scrutiny for employers and employees as well. Is there anything you can tell us about that?
Yeah, so those are a couple of good topics. First of all, I am an eternal optimist, so I'm going to really try to focus on some of the good news for employers as well. I don't believe it's doom and gloom. I think it just requires additional creativity. But back to your question about creative options and independent contractors and more legislation and more employment law cases, employers have tended to always be a little bit risky with regard to their interpretation of the independent contractor guidelines. And they are guidelines. And so during our conference, one of the topics that our chief legal counsel, Kelly Hayden, focused on in her presentation was the fact that employers need to be aware that they should only be hiring independent contractors for roles that are not the same as roles that they have regular employees employed in.
That's
They
interesting.
should be, so if you and I need a new roof put on our house, or our house painted, or some remodeling done, we don't tell those people who are hired to do that project what time to get there, what kind of materials to bring. We measure their performance on the finished product. We don't have a lot of control over the methodologies they use. And so employers need to follow those similar practices. If you are exercising a lot of command and control over individuals that you are considering to be independent contractors, and those independent contractors are only working for you and not receiving benefits like your regular employees, you could be running afoul of those guidelines. And I think we will be seeing more regulatory action in this arena. It's been an area of interest for many years by the courts, both at the state and federal level. And I think we're going to see more of it.
Yeah, I mean, I would assume it does impact, state income tax, and if we're, corporations are paying both employment tax and employees are paying tax. I think there's some, opportunity loss for our government in terms of collecting what they probably deem, theirs. So I do think it's going to be an interesting landscape as we move forward. So I'm going to switch gears and talk about, the theme that sort of held everyone's attention. There was lots of articles written on the Great Resignation. We saw it play out in 2021 and 2022. But in 2023, we're hearing this new headline that's capturing attention called the Great Regret. So there's some data that you guys help serve up according to Jobless 2022 U.S. job market report. 1 in 4 people that had quit their job regretted the decision. And so I'm curious to see how you're seeing this play out with some of your association members, or even in your work as a board leader, at the World of Work. What is this? Really, is this like a sexy headline, or is this really a fact that's playing out?
You know, obviously, anything that starts with the great is meant to get the attention of the reader. So, media has fueled some of these trends and, put them in the headlines on a regular basis. But the great regret, one of the data points we found showed that a quarter of people who left their jobs during the Great Resignation are not that happy that they did. A paycheck study on a similar theme shows that up to 80%,
Wow.
80, are not so sure that they made the right decision. Some of the reasons: they underestimated what the new role would entail. So maybe they thought they were leaving for better work-life balance or a lighter workload. and they found that not to be true. They also miss their coworkers. They sometimes miss the culture of the organization they work for. Some employees are regretting the fact that they made a change because they wanted to have a 100% remote job, and they now wish they were at an employer that had at least the option to go to work a couple days a week in an office environment with their colleagues. And so I think the phenomena is real. Whether I think the real number of people that are regretting it is probably somewhere between 25 and 80%. And it probably ebbs and flows. You know, Back to one of your other points about the demographic changes and the skills drought. I mean, we're seeing certain industries that got severely whacked during the pandemic because of the working conditions and how difficult that pandemic period was in terms of their workload. And so teachers, healthcare workers, retail workers, hospitality workers, many of them are choosing to leave not just their job, but their industry altogether. And I think there will be some great regret from some individuals who were dedicated to a career or a profession, but due to due to burnout and working conditions, poor working conditions, lack of time to work out, maybe.
Yeah, say that.
They may regret leaving a profession that was a passion of theirs, that they connected with the mission of or the values of. So that's going to still be playing out in the years to come. So the great regret is real. Uh, it's going to be a trend that continues, but it's a really individual question, right? Whether or not you make the right decision. From the employer perspective, one of the things that we've been noting as a concerning trend, and I think it's a remnant or a way that the great regret is playing out, is we're hearing from many of our member organizations that new hires are leaving 2 or 3 months into a new job. So they're not waiting the year or two. Maybe they're saying, I won't even put this job on my resume. I realize I made a bad decision. This is not a good fit. Either they're in an industry where they know that opportunities are plentiful, and or they know they still have a great relationship with their former employer and they have a chance of going back.
Yeah. No, it's so interesting because I was just attending. I'm at the Entrepreneurial or Operating System, or EOS conference right now, and that was one of the focuses of a session I just attended about, really, we call it accountability charts in EOS. And the accountability chart versus like a job description really gives you a much clearer picture of what you really own in a role. And so, building a strong accountability chart, and referencing that throughout the review, like interview process, and then even as they get into the first 90 days or 6 months of employment, re-evaluating, going back to that accountability chart, I think is it really reinforces, you were hired for X, and now that you've been in the company for a few months, are you actually experiencing things that you were told you would experience in the role? So, really interesting. I think they also mentioned that this is, a younger demographic really does want to know exactly. They're not going to be, as accepting of coming in and then, the job is completely different than the expectations that were set during the interview process. So I know we've talked about it in some of our client relationships, and we've seen these alumni types of structures where you're actually creating some structure and framework around staying in contact with past employees. I think they may not return to you as a boomerang employee, but they also may be able to refer other great candidates to you as you're starting to hire. So what other things are you seeing employers do to like be able to reach back or stay connected to their past workforce.
So keep in mind the old cliche, never burn a bridge, right? So employers used to feel like they had been broken up with when an employee had chooses or had chosen to leave them, right? It's like it
It's
hit hard, you're dead to me, right? Those days have come and gone. So, right, I think employers are much more cognizant of the fact that people have all sorts of reasons that they choose to either stay at your organization or move on. And so treating employees with respect and like very, very open and encouraging, even when they're choosing to leave, can really net positive results down the road. So some of the more formal things employers are doing are actual alumni clubs, much like universities have, where they send newsletters. Maybe they have social media, meetup groups. They invite people to happy hours or holiday parties. Those are more formal. Many times, big organizations have these groups, especially, like a big accounting firm or a firm that hires lots of recent college grads who often you know, get their early experience at these firms, then go on into industry or other jobs, but eventually might come back to the big firm when they've gotten some other experience. On a way less formal basis, staying connected on LinkedIn, sharing articles, liking people's posts, commenting when good things happen to a former employee, asking them out for coffee or asking if they want to jump on a Zoom or a Teams call, keeping in touch. HR Source has a number of boomerang employees, and almost all of them came back to us through informal networking
Yeah.
connections, right? One employee, current employee, has lunch with another uh, former employee and finds out they're not that happy in their current position, or they really didn't like working part-time, or they retired too soon. And all of those are door openers to, hey, do we have a role for this person? Could they come back to us on either a fractional basis or a full-time position? Could they be a gig employee or help us out with some projects? What's the appetite for re-engaging? And we've had great success and are big fans of the boomerang employee phenomenon, but it does require some outreach effort and some energy and resources to take advantage of these opportunities when they arise, because you're not always going to have the perfect open position when these individuals become available. So you might have to be creative with how you bring them back into the organization.
Yeah, I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount from just staying in touch with past employees about just even improving the current employee experience, because they'll I love asking that question about what is that one or two things that you're getting from this new this new environment that you weren't getting at Red Caffeine, and that has sparked some things that I've been able to just initiate, because it's just I would never have known if I didn't get a chance to have dinner or have a coffee with somebody and ask those types of questions. So some great ideas. What let's talk a little bit more about turning the table, because I know this is not the headline grabber, but you and I were starting to talk about employer regret. The market softening, our economic conditions, this looming recession, inflation, all these things that are really starting to constrict our economy are going to force employers to make some hard decisions. So talk to us a little bit about, what does that look like? What are you guys seeing in that? And how are you advising your association members to really think about them? Not. I know we've all invested so much in recruiting great people, and it's just challenging to have to think about letting anybody go at this point.
Exactly. So, a couple of leading indicators that we're starting to see but not at a level where we have big concerns. But obviously, the headline grabbers are all of these big companies, big publicly traded companies that are doing mass layoffs. They're getting a lot of negative press and ugly PR, some of it based on the way in which they're delivering these messages, right? Imagine yourself as an employee from one of these companies that's getting national headlines that on Tuesday they're laying off 30% of the workforce. It's going to ruin your weekend if you read that in the paper on Thursday or hear it, right? It's causing a ripple effect of anxiety, stress, concerns that doesn't give you a warm and fuzzy about those organizations. So they're getting a lot of the press. Our leading indicators are a slight uptick in the number of requests for assistance with severance agreements, followed by some requests for assistance with reductions in force. So if a member of ours has multiple terminations or layoffs happening in the same day, they often ask for our assistance to make sure that they have all the support on hand required to deliver those messages, answer questions, help people understand the severance agreement, the COBRA healthcare benefits continuation. So we're getting a few requests for those. We also have had a slight slowdown in the number of requests we have to assist members with recruiting. Not in any of these areas. It's not a concerning level by any stretch. Nowhere close to the last Great Recession and or the pandemic, but just here and there, we're paying attention, obviously, because the headlines. In terms of options for employers, I like to think of it on a continuum, right? A mass reduction in force is blunt trauma to the organization and only to be considered when all other alternatives have been pursued, right? I mean, it is a dangerous proposition. The data shows it takes years to recover from a mass layoff, at least 3 years. And for some organizations, they report they've never really recovered, right? That it was so damaging to their organization from morale, innovation, ability to recruit. So that's on one far end of the continuum. I guess declaring bankruptcy, shutting down operations, closing locations altogether are all over there on that side of the chart. In the middle are strategic layoffs, right? Where you are going either department by department, product line by product line, location by location, and strategically determining where you're over capacity in terms of your staff and you're not making your margins, profits aren't where you need them to be. That's, moving this way on the continuum. Some other options, and some employers would argue they're doing that all the time, right? We're constantly monitoring for people failing to meet performance expectations, right? In any given moment, there's usually at least a few, if not a lot of people, a number of people, I should say, a percentage of our workforce on performance improvement plans, right? Who didn't do well on their performance review, who need to improve in order to meet expectations. Another option is furloughs, right? So asking people to either take a voluntary pay cut or to reduce their hours to help save jobs. Many employers have been quite successful over the years getting people to raise their hand and say, hey, we're looking for a way to reduce some costs. One of the things we're considering is furloughs, and we would like to take voluntary options, look at our voluntary options first before we pick and choose who that will happen for or do it across the board. Same thing can be said, of whether or not that's going to work in your organization. All of these are just options. You may also look for people who are open to a voluntary retirement or an early retirement. And many organizations will sweeten those deals by bumping up their severance packages or giving them a soft landing by covering health insurance for a longer period or allowing people to resign instead of it being a termination or a layoff. So we recommend really exploring all of those options before you go to that extreme measure of layoffs or reductions in force.
Is there any other creative options? I was, moving somebody from full time to contract or hourly work. Is that, what are the legal repercussions, or is there anything that you should be concerned about in those situations?
Well, you should be concerned on the independent contractor arena. If you make someone a project worker and you're treating them for all other intents and purposes like an employee, you're
Okay.
going to be running afoul of the law. If you're going to have someone work on an hourly basis so that you no longer have to pay them benefits, again, I'm not saying this isn't an option, but you're going to need to work with legal counsel and ensure that you're calling a spade and you're complying with all of the relevant employment laws, because exempt and non-exempt classifications is one area of the law, and the independent contractor guidelines also need to be considered. How much flexibility, if you're hiring someone as a project employee, are you telling them what days of the week they need to work, still providing them equipment and a workspace, but just eliminating their benefits package?
Okay.
That's probably not appropriate.
Excellent. Thank you. I know it's a complex strategy, and I know I've been talking to some other employers about these types of things, and I do see people leaning into the optionality angle so that they can, really work with their team to make the best decisions for both the organization as well as the employees. So let's switch gears again and talk a little bit about the, return to office or remote and hybrid options. I do feel like we're seeing a lot more people ask people to return to work in the office, and then others have, really embraced remote working or some combination of the two. What are you seeing in terms of those trends, and how, is it causing people to leave an organization if they're being called back to, going to the office on a more full-time basis?
So again, so many headlines on this topic. So return to office even has its own acronym now, RTO. Uh,
Of course it does.
um, and employers have gotten really an amazing amount of pushback from their employees who have said, give us a compelling reason to come back. Don't tell us we're coming back because you have rent to pay, or because you have an office here waiting for us, or because you want to see us more often. We need a compelling reason. We have proven during the pandemic that we are hardworking. You can trust us. Our performance has been almost as good or better. We like the fact that we're not wasting time commuting, that we're able to balance or align our work and family life much more effectively. So there's been the most pushback to these mandates that are not coupled with a compelling reason to come back. So that has made many employers reevaluate and say, wow, we didn't think that one out very well. We didn't communicate very effectively. We need to reevaluate, change our messaging, perhaps change our policy. Some of them did that after they saw people leave in droves, or they just had people not come in, right? Their policy said 3 days a week and people showed up one or two. And unless you are monitoring card swipes or other ways of monitoring, right, which some employers are doing, uh, getting employees to comply has been harder than employers expected. So, for the most part, the hybrid workplace has been embraced. Employees say that they like the combination. They like getting out of their own home and their yoga pants a few days a week and coming back to the office to see their colleagues, collaborate, have team meetings, use the resources available, big copy machines, free coffee and water or food, collaborative, nice technology. So the popularity of the hybrid workplace is here to stay. There's lots of different variations on a theme. I read an article that said on the two extremes, so if you're looking at the bell curve, only 6% of white collar or office employees like to come in 100% of the time. They would prefer being in the office. 6%, six. That's a
Wow.
low number. And then 28% are divided three other ways: 100% remote work, never come in, 3+ days a week, or under 3 days a week. So it's kind of evenly distributed with a very small subset. So it's not 25% across the board, uh, because there is just a small group of employees. Again, let's be considerate. And we learned this early on in the pandemic. There are a whole subset, very important part of our economy, that don't have a choice.
Right.
You'll always be going to a workplace. So I always want to be completely respectful of hospitality, manufacturing, healthcare, many industries that are not going to have the opportunity to enjoy all of the benefits of a remote or hybrid workplace due to the nature of their work or the industry that they're in.
Yeah, I mean, I'm curious. We got a great question, but I want to just ask one follow on. Like, what have you heard in terms of compelling reasons that people have, leveraged to bring their workforce back? Because I'm hard pressed to think of a lot of compelling reasons, unless, like you mentioned before. I mean, we work a lot in manufacturing and sectors where it never was a hybrid or a remote opportunity.
Right. So a few: onboarding, training. It's like certain skills are just much more effectively trained in person. Mentoring, collaboration, creativity, brainstorming, innovation, testing of products and services, um, delivering educational programs. I mentioned earlier, over 300 people turned up at our conference last week. These are the same 300 people that were logging in online when we were doing virtual conferences, who now say they missed the networking. They missed raising their hand in a session and asking their question live. They enjoyed breaking bread with their HR peers and with our team members. So collaboration, creativity, innovation, R&D, onboarding. Heads down work, by and large, has been proven to be more effective in a place that's comfortable, quiet, and away from your colleagues, right? Heads down writing, research, etc., can be done very effectively. A lot of customer service can be done very effectively from the comfort of wherever you happen to be working. But some of those things that really rely on the human connection and learning from others happen well. And I'm not saying necessarily in a traditional workplace, but where you're gathered with the people that you're collaborating, learning from, or with.
Yeah, I just heard today, and I wish I remember the source, but it was about task-oriented roles that really do, excel from an at-home or remote workspace versus strategic or collaboration, where it is a lot more viable when you're doing it either in person or finding a creative way to make sure that it's still a very similar experience. So one of the questions that came in is, it sounds like a consistent and strategic internal communication is becoming more and more critical. So rather than a nice to have, I mean, I think we even talked about like even the roles that you need within your HR department, because you really do need like this dedicated people person that can help you with the learning and development and culture building aspect. And then you need more the compliance person that making sure that you're staying, abreast of all the regulatory things that are impacting us. So how would you recommend companies without an internal communications department think about, creating those internal communication strategies and
Well, there are lots of organizations, Red Caffeine among them, and many other organizations. I mean, HR Source obviously can help from a compliance perspective, but we can also help make recommendations on employee communications. It's been a wonderful evolution of HR professionals figuring out that they need to be connected to the marketing team in their organization, right? And that people with strong writing skills exist in all different departments of the organization. Sometimes managers and supervisors are really good at it. And so it might be through some trial and error. Sometimes the top leader of the organization is a super effective communicator, maybe not in writing, but I've been seeing increasingly organizations use, videos where a leader will, instead of doing a traditional town hall meeting, they will send up, periodic YouTube videos or Vimeo videos to distribute to their team to communicate new messages. Posting things up on Teams or Slack or on whatever portal your organization is using, traditional mediums like email, face-to-face meetings, but figuring out what the messages you need to send, what medium is going to be most effective, and whether or not you have the internal talent or skill sets to write
within,
or
yeah, within
to,
your HR department.
yeah.
I love that you said that, because I was just talking about that again, just, in the last couple of days. We were pitching, employee communication strategies for years, and and HR teams were really hungry for those, that support system, but they didn't have the budgets. Are you seeing people more apt to fund those types of initiatives now than they were maybe even 3 or 4 years ago?
Yeah, I think they are. And I think many of them are putting it under the umbrella of the employment brand, right? Because the employment brand isn't just communicated to prospects, right? To applicants. It
Right.
also needs to resonate and be in sync with your employees. And so, again, whether or not you have the internal talent to do that or whether or not you're seeking outside assistance, if an organization is struggling with recruitment, retention, engagement, collaboration, um, communication is often at the core in terms of one of the methodologies that can be most effective at bridging those gaps. We had to learn during the pandemic how to spread news quickly, right? We were all just drinking out of a fire hose and having, from an organizational leadership perspective, figure out how to deliver these messages to our teams. So, in our favor, we learned how to speed up the process and not overthink it. We are also living in an environment where people want us to keep it real, a super formal communication, as opposed to getting something out that's quick, authentic, organic, clear. Speed is of the essence. Employees aren't going to wait around. And if you leave a vacuum of information, they're going to make stuff up and it
Right.
might not be the right stuff. So I love the idea of figuring out if you have the internal resources to do it yourself. If you don't, get help. And it's worth the dollars that you pay for it if you find the right partner to help you.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Now, in terms of a couple other great questions that have come in, has the acceptance of remote workers broadened the talent pool for most companies? Are you seeing I mean, I know it's definitely opened up the flexibilities for most organizations don't require you to come to the office, but is that something that you're seeing across all of these larger member organizations that you're a part of?
Yes, it has opened up the talent pool. If you're not having a 5 day come to the office, right? Someone might in the past have given pause if it was going to be a 45 minute. I think the average commute in the Chicagoland area pre-pandemic was 45 minutes a day each way.
Yeah.
I know it was over 30. You know, that might have had a chilling effect on some people who didn't want to make that commute. If you're only asking people to come in a few days a week, that could again be an opportunity to open up the talent pool. If you're not requiring people to come in at all, it could broaden it even more. Just a couple of concerns in this area. It is a conscientious business decision to decide to recruit from anywhere, because there are state laws in this country, and you can't just start employing people in other states without setting up a business presence there and paying the applicable taxes, unemployment tax, state taxes. And so many employers during the pandemic played dumb, or their employees weren't completely upfront with them, and they ended up running afoul of the law by not being in compliance. They pretended, or maybe they really thought their employees were just on vacation in California or Arkansas or Arizona, but they were really living there. And
Okay.
so employers need to, if they start posting jobs on a national or global basis, they need to first understand the business implications and the resources it's going to take to have employees in states other than the states in which they're currently operating.
Yeah, I mean, we ran into an issue with being able to insure somebody that we were hiring. It was like I never, we've never, in all the years I've run a business, I've never had this happen before. So it was really an interesting dynamic. We found a way to work through it, but it was something that we just never had been faced with. Now, in terms of, sort of emphasizing, I remember doing this. So I'm glad I love this question. Are are people leveraging the value add back that expenses that of commuting are you know are if you are working remote, you don't have the typical commuting expenses. Are they leveraging that, and how they're talking about that as a perk to employees? Because I remember doing the math for somebody. I really wanted to hire this one developer, and I'm like, hey, you take that hour-long train ride, and it's X amount of days, and how much time back that that could really be viewed as compensation back. So I'm curious if other employers are using that as something that kind of tells somebody how much they would be saving by working for a more remote business.
So that's a great question, Kathy, and it's such a sticky wicket. It's a little bit of quicksand because employers, behind closed doors, leaders are talking about it all day long, saying people don't have to buy business clothes anymore. They save all this money on gas. They're not spending money on daycare or after school programs the way they used to. They get to eat their lunch at home. They don't go to Starbucks all the time on their way to work. They're saving loads of money. Keep in mind that this move to hybrid work happened at the same time inflation started running rampant, and the pressure on wages and compensation was heavy. So, from an employer perspective, I love the idea of think about all these positives. If you ask most employees, they're going to downplay that because they're going to point to the competitive market and the wages, and they're going to also say, it's not a competitive advantage anymore. Like, everybody's allowing hybrid or remote work. So it doesn't mean that my pay should be impacted in any way because it's the norm, right? It reminds me of years ago, one of the services we provided, and some employers still do these. It used to be called like a benefits value statement or the hidden paycheck. And it was a document that employees received on an annual basis. And some human resource information systems still have this as an option, but it was a way to capture how much all of these your real benefits that everyone values and knows about: healthcare, 401k, paid time off, vacation time, holidays. But then it also allowed a dollar amount to be assigned for things like free coffee, free lunch, free parking, logo wear, free Wi-Fi, cell phone, whatever else. Employees universally kind of downplayed those statements. They weren't like universally embraced and loved. It was kind of like, I really care about my paycheck and my real benefits. All that other stuff is just icing on the cake. And it bothers me, but it's the way the world is right now. I don't think, while employees intellectually understand all of these extra benefits they're receiving, employers pointing it out on a regular basis isn't a big warm and fuzzy.
Okay, so it's not something that should be highlighted in your recruiting strategy. All right. Well, I know we're running low on time, but I definitely want to just at least touch on the transparent salary movement. So, can you tell us about some of the things that have happened around pay disclosure laws that were really enacted in the U.S. in the last year, and what are some of our legal obligations as employers to and some of the benefits of sharing salary information in the hiring process or as part of a retention strategy?
So, pay transparency is evolving and is making its way across the nation and will continue to. So, back to the conversation we just had about some employers allowing work from everywhere. If you happen to be either operating a business or have employees in one of the states that require pay disclosure in a job posting, you're going to need to take that into consideration whenever you're posting jobs. So it's required employers to be more aware of what's happening in other states, depending on whether or not their staffing strategy is occurring or applies to other states. So it's not going away anytime soon. It is being driven by a whole host of factors, one of which is obviously diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts. Some years ago in Illinois, we had a law passed, which again, we were not the earliest state. California, Massachusetts, there are certain states who tend to be early adopters, usually blue states, but that's not always the case, where we were no longer allowed to ask job applicants about their salary history. And those laws were passed because women and minorities have tended to be paid significantly less than their similarly situated male peers. So those were some of the first laws that I would put under the umbrella of pay transparency. Some of the more progressive laws in this area include things like posting the salary range, right away when a job post goes up. And some employers are just adopting that as a leading practice, whether or not it's being required by law. So I know I'm painting with a little bit of a broad brush because we don't have all of the employers on this great session today who are just hiring Illinois employees,
Right.
right? And so you're going to have to be more aware than ever of these laws. If you're a member of HR Source or read our publications, we're writing articles on these topics regularly. Pay transparency as a concept is, its time has come, even though it's hard for employers to get used to, right?
Yeah.
Because, I remember when that first law was passed about not asking for salary history, our phones were ringing off the hook with employers saying, how are we supposed to know what to offer someone? Right? Because we used to key the offer on their current rate. And it was like, no, Now you need to evaluate the job. You need to have a compensation philosophy. Do you match the market, lead the market, lag the market? What are your job related reasons that someone would be in the middle of their range, above the range, right? These are things you need to decide before you go to the labor market and start recruiting for talent, not be an afterthought once you've determined who it is you're going to make an offer to.
Yeah, and I mean, I think we all, I mean, we've been doing it for years now. The first time I had an employee say they felt they were underpaid. I'm like, based on what? And so, I really do believe that as a leader of an organization, you really do have to have your pulse on the pay bands within different roles for your organization and be able to point to the sources that you're, using to garner those pay bands. And I know you guys do salary data research and reporting too. So, there's a lot of resources out there to inform us. It's not perfect. I mean, there's so many different discrepancies, but at least we've got at least a starting point to validate the way we want to pay somebody, in our compensation policies should, or philosophy should really follow that. So I cannot believe we've got 4 minutes left. So I want to make sure everyone knows how to connect with you if they've got additional questions or want to, learn more about some of the services and offering that you provide at HR Source. So please feel free to reach out to Mary Lynn directly through her LinkedIn account or her email address, and put business as unusual in the subject line or somewhere in the message so she knows it came from our session today. I want to thank you so much for, again, just, blowing my mind with all the great information you shared. I really want to thank our attendees today because they asked some great questions. I thought, were really added a lot of context to this discussion. So thank you for all of you that attended today's session. And I also want to just give a nod to our sponsors. M3, HR Source, of course, and Insperity are three of our sponsors. And then I want to tell you a little bit about our next guests that we have coming up in May. So what we've got coming up with you is it really just how to unlock sales and marketing growth with using buyer personas. And I would also say that, we use employee personas too in our work when we're looking at recruiting strategies. And so, we talk about buyer personas. Did you ever really want to give your prospects a little truth serum? So what would you ask them? What would they say? How would these insights change the way you position your products and services? So we're going to be having Jim Kraus from the Buyer Persona Institute join us on May 18th as we talk about this next topic of buyer personas. And some of the session takeaways you can expect is how buyer personas make high-stake complex purchasing decisions. So really understanding what factors they're thinking about when they're thinking about working with you, how much research they're doing in advance of even having a first conversation with you. And that goes as well for employees. I think, looking at employee personas in the very same way. How to get the information you need to market and sell to the buyers effectively, and then what information should really be part of your buyer's personas. So, and then what really doesn't really matter and factor into the decision. So Jim is the president of the Buyer Persona Institute and a leading authority on buyer personas and buying insights. So I hope you'll come back and join us for our session in May. But again, thank you, Mary Lynn. This was, a fabulous session as always, and we really appreciate all of our guests today for attending.
Thanks, Kathy. It's always great to work with Red Caffeine and so fun to talk to you about these topics that are so near and dear to our hearts.
Yes, absolutely. Well, thank you, everyone.